The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis is not always thought of as one of the great books in the history of philosophy, but I think it is one of the great books, and we probably should think of it as such. Now, there's a lot in it, in philosophy of education, philosophy of science, and in ethics, and more. This video here is just a short introduction to one slice of the ethics. It's in part 2 of the Abolition, where Lewis argues that moral principles cannot be justified on any foundation other than moral principles which are fundamentally true in and of themselves, not for any non-moral reason. He speaks here in language reminiscent of Kant, talking of the fundamental postulates of practical reason, i.e. the fundamental moral principles which are true in and of themselves and which justify moral reasoning, but themselves are not justified, much as the fundamental principles of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, or fundamental axioms in mathematics, justify other things, but are themselves not justified, and not in any need of justification either. Now, Lewis does believe this, and he's defending the doctrine of moral truth, the doctrine of the Tao, as he calls it, from a certain kind of objection. But, strictly speaking, in part 2, he's not arguing for it. What he's arguing for is the choice. The choice between recognizing that some moral principles are simply true in themselves, and being honest Nietzschean amoralist and just doing without morality. And of course he prefers the recognition of the Tao, but his argument is only for that choice between honest Nietzschean amoralism and the Tao. Now, understand that he was dealing with a certain kind of debunking of morality. It was the way of those who argue against certain moral principles that they don't like, based on standards that, if applied consistently, would undermine all morality, but then try to smuggle in moral principles they like and justify them on non-moral foundations. Typically, they would appeal to the instincts as a justification of morality, or to usefulness. So, Lewis' argument is something like this, in part 2 of the Abolition. If any moral principles are true at all, then there are fundamental moral principles which are true in and of themselves, the Tao. Or they're justified by instincts, or they're justified by usefulness. Now, you can't do it by our instincts, because any statement about our instincts is a statement of what is. And a statement of what is does not justify a statement of what ought to be. Moral principles are ought statements. Is statements do not justify ought statements. Any factual description of what is provides no support at all, Lewis says, for a statement of what should be. And thus, Lewis says, the appeal to instincts will not work. What about the appeal to usefulness? Well, that's not going to work either, because what is useful is always useful for something. So, if we say that moral principles are useful, and that's why we justify them, what is it they're useful for? That thing they're useful for, if it's going to justify morality, should itself be considered something which is of value in itself. And if there is such a thing, then there is a fundamental moral principle which recognizes that value, and which is true in and of itself, and without justification by any other principle. So the usefulness approach doesn't work. And so we're left with the conclusion, if any morality is true at all, then there are fundamental moral principles which are true in and of themselves and should be recognized as such. And Lewis says we are left with the choice of making that recognition, or following through on this debunking that was so popular in his day, and being honest Nietzschean amoralists. Now, I need to mention in closing that Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, which in many respects stands alongside Lewis as this very interesting critique of the emotivist tradition in modern thought, and an analysis of contemporary moral thinking. Alasdair MacIntyre's book, which stands alongside Lewis, and I think should be read alongside Lewis, and vice versa. MacIntyre's book does say that you can justify an ought from an is. Now, I think if you take his approach and show it to Lewis, Lewis will say that's very good. Because Lewis likes Aristotelian thinking, and Alasdair MacIntyre is using Aristotelian thinking. But it is important that there is a distinction. Lewis follows a number of modern philosophers who thought that no ought statement can be justified by an is. But MacIntyre provides an interesting and very friendly sort of criticism to this particular premise in Lewis's argument.